to FEA Day and our midday, depending on where you're coming from in the world, discussion on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, international perspectives. We're so happy to have you here with us. My name is Angie Schaffer. I am the Executive Director of the Fund for Education Abroad, and I'm joined by a bunch of colleagues and friends and mentors who will all introduce themselves throughout the session. But we invite you just to listen in, pose questions in the chat. If you have questions that you'd love for us to discuss during the Q&A, you're welcome to pose them at any time or hold them and pose them then. But we're really excited to have you here. Thank you for joining us for this discussion. This discussion is based in CAPA's occasional paper number 10, the JEDI anthology. And that anthology draws upon contributions made to JEDI thought in international education over the past dozen years or so. And so I'm really excited to have you all here with us to talk through this. And I will hand it over to Mike Woolf, who's going to kick us off.
Thank you. Well, the intention here really is to revisit the ideas that we try to put together in the occasional paper 10 for the JEDI anthology. Now, I'm not going to go into elaborate introductions here because you don't need them, but I will give you the names and affiliations of our distinguished presenters in the order of presentation. So first, as we've heard, Angie Schaffer, Executive Director of FEA. She's also our host, by the way, an initiator of this session. So if it's not very good, you know who to blame. I don't want to hear it. Then we have Andrew Gordon, founder of Diversity Abroad and the CEO. Martha Johnson, Executive Vice President and Provost for CEACAPA. Keshia Abraham, President of the Abraham Consulting Agency. Giselda Beaudin, Director of Global Initiatives at Rollins College. And I'm Mike Woolf, I'm Senior Editor of the series, and I also work at CEACAPA. So I want to take just a few minutes to explain the rationale for the publication. As I saw it, there's no party line, you know, this was just my perception, before I asked colleagues to take over with their perspectives. Incidentally, this volume is available freely in print or online. Start with a sense of unease, actually, that informs the anthology, that drove it really from my perspective. And this has nothing to do with the important principles within JEDI agendas. My concern was and is with what and who are missing. The dominant narrative, understandably, focuses on the American context in general and African-American inclusion in particular. Now, however urgent and creditable this is, I also believe that we're international educators, and so we have an obligation to ourselves and to our students to expand the consciousness of wider contexts. So consequently, in the anthology, we had essays that discuss LGBTQ rights, disability, false conviction, class, and other areas of inequity. And furthermore, we very consciously spread the geographical range to include essays on India, France, Africa, Sri Lanka, and the Roma in Europe. So one intention was to try and get behind the parochial, beyond the parochial, to present situations that don't have widespread international exposure, and to represent voices that are significantly less powerful, therefore less heard, than those of America. Now, one example of what I mean, I know it's contentious really, but what I mean by the power of the American voice. I doubt that many people here have heard of the death of Stanislav Tomáš, a Roma man who died in June 2021 in the Czech Republic. A police officer knelt on his neck while others restrained him. This event made no headlines. The police were exonerated. And indifference to it, of course, contrasts dramatically with the response to George Floyd's murder about a year earlier in almost identical circumstances. What we had instead with the murder of this Roma man was a kind of shameful silence. And one commentator noted that the truth is that the West isn't much interested. And we could have many examples of that. I think Iran right now is another one. So there are marginalized communities in countries where our students study, and they remain voiceless and barely visible, beyond the radical, certainly beyond the radical empathy envisaged by Isabel Wilkerson. So I conclude really, there's no international community of the oppressed or suffering, nor is concern with injustice truly inclusive. I regret, by the way, that we didn't have essays on the discrimination and persecution of such as the Rohingya in Myanmar, Kurds in Turkey. The persecution of Christians has similarly not generated much attention. Religious intolerance is largely outside the scope of interest. In a short essay, I recently posed the question, where are the Jews in JEDI? Oddly absent despite significant increases in anti-Semitism. So it seems to me there are two imperatives. One is, of course, the core imperative, which is make opportunities to study abroad more accessible. But at the same time, I think we need to recognize that the conditions of American society are not necessarily reenacted elsewhere, because this speaks to a core aspiration in education abroad to demonstrate that the norms with which we are familiar are not universal. We also need to recognize that the divisions of the Cold War have been replaced by a different kind of collision between open and closed ideologies. One impact is that buried bigotry has moved in many contexts from private prejudice towards legitimized public discourse, and in extreme cases, government policies. So it seems self-evident to me in that environment, the belief in JEDI principles imposes an obligation to at least address, get interested in global inequalities. But let me conclude with a comment on the occasional papers. I've worked on them for the last 200 years, it feels like. Our publications intend to make space for theory as well as practice, perspectives across countries, disagreement, diverse ideological convictions. And as many of these essays demonstrate in this volume, going beyond slogans and cliches evokes complexity and exposes the dangers of simplistic responses, whether they come from progressive or conservative thought. My conviction is that respectful disagreement is a creative necessity. And I often return, and people are bored with hearing this, to the example of two rabbis born before Jesus. One was called Shammai and the other Hillel the Elder. And they didn't seek at all to reach consensus and disagreed about almost everything under the sun. But their discourses always were concluded with a note that these were, I quote, disagreements for the sake of heaven. Now, taking heaven out of the equation, thought moves beyond superficial reiteration of received ideas when dogma is subject to deconstruction, when we stop to listen to each other. And that's where I'm going to stop and pass on to Angie.
Thank you so much, Mike. I think that that is really helpful to help us sort of found the discussion today in thinking forward about the voices that we want to keep including in these conversations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about an interesting P in international education. Again, I'm Angie Schaffer. I'm the Executive Director of the Fund for Education Abroad, and I wrote my part in the JEDI anthology from that perspective. I have a background in study abroad. I worked in study abroad offices at institutions. I've also worked for an international exchange nonprofit organization doing inbound and outbound programming and program development. And then I've also worked in corporate and foundation relations, sponsored research, and as a grant writer. And so this work with the Fund for Education Abroad is really an interesting sort of marriage of all of those backgrounds. And I've been thinking a lot about the ways that we talk about different things in international education. Programming, practices, these are the P's that we focus on a lot. And I'm asking us to include another P, philanthropy. It isn't, and I feel like wasn't something as much discussed. I know that lots of organizations have had scholarships for a long time. There's always been sort of the federally funded and government sponsored scholarships. And I do pay some mind to those and talk about how those have really changed the future of our field in my chapter. And I'm really grateful to all of the organizations that have been sponsoring scholarships for a long time for students to make study abroad more inclusive and accessible. philanthropy adds a whole other level to this discussion, right? And maybe we haven't talked about it much with good reason, because it is a tricky concept. And I think it's long been couched in this deficit model language, right? Even some of the official definitions of philanthropy are just couched in this have to have nots, give to less kind of language that I just honestly cannot stand. And so one of the goals of FEA is to try to change that a little bit. We have the potential, I think, to really impact all of our work moving forward by including philanthropy and philanthropic practices in the work to diversify study abroad and make it more inclusive and accessible. And this isn't just by giving money and resources to students to make up for longstanding inequities and practices that are rooted in prejudice and white supremacy and just supremacist and hegemonic thinking. I mean, really inviting folks into the fold from lots of different sectors to become investors in JEDI guided and rooted work that we're all here today, I think, to do. The relationship between advocacy and philanthropy is an interesting one to kind of dissect. Philanthropy, I think, has, again, in as much as it's been sort of deficit model language, it's also been a little bit more considered to be a passive act, right? You may give funding to a place and then they kind of do that work for you. And advocacy requires action. And so how can we bring these two concepts and practices together? I think philanthropic work is really strong philanthropic work, and the work that we want to do as an organization, and I think as a field moving forward, is it requires us to invite a lot of actors to the table, including competitors coming together through a common cause and work they want to do, and trying to accomplish that work holistically as a field. We've seen a lot of success with our Access Partner program, which is providers and institutions abroad, typically competing for the same students, coming together and really talking about best practices and thinking through language we're using and being very intentional about recruitment practices and how to really change the game of study abroad moving forward to make it accessible and inclusive. And I think that that is an ability of philanthropic work. That is something that we can all do together in philanthropy to really advance what we're trying to do overall. Philanthropy is asking for money, yes, and it gives us that practice, gives us a good reason to come up with some really compelling statistics and storytelling to consider the impact of the work that we're doing. To frame, I'm preaching to the choir right now. You all know why this work is important, but to have to rethink our messaging and come up with information and statistics while, navigating that tricky water, the tricky path, I think, of sort of overemphasizing to a potential donor or to a potential stakeholder why this is important to them, and customizing it so much that you end up being beholden to something you've promised them. It's still an interesting path to navigate to come up with the reasons that they should support this work and getting them to think about the impact of the work we're doing overall down the road, and thinking about doing that outside of the field, right? To frame it outside of our field is just a great exercise for all of us, and I think gives us information and storytelling that can compel even further bringing stakeholders into this sphere. And then when making those pitches to potential donors and thinking about our philanthropic work, really, again, making us think about the language we're using and thinking really intentionally about making sure it is asset-based and not deficit model-based. And I think relating to the goals down the road and the work that we're all doing to make study abroad and international education more just, more inclusive, more accessible, we have to think really strategically about that language we're using. And so all of these have been really good exercises for FEA. We are not perfect. We continue to move in a direction where we're just making that fourth P, like I think we're all here today to do, which is progress towards actually inclusive, accessible, just, and diverse study abroad education overall, and eventually to a more just world. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to someone I have learned so much from, Andrew Gordon.
Thank you, and thank you all for having me. It's fun to read back through the essay that was written basically a decade ago, and before the webinar, chatting a little bit about how much has changed, but also how much remains the same. So a quick introduction. My name is Andrew Gordon. I'm the founder of Diversity Abroad, and I founded Diversity Abroad in 2006, which seems like a long time ago now, but had the opportunity of working at the intersection of diversity, equity, inclusion, and global education for the last 16 years. And when I reviewed the essay that I had originally written, the title of the essay was "A Commitment to Diversify Education Abroad." And going through it, the first thing that came to me was just, wow, language changes. And the way that we talked about essentially JEDI, we were talking about the same thing, but just a language that we were using. We use underrepresentation so much more, access so much more. And these are still words that are relevant to our work. But what's interesting, I think I would say to me, or one of the things that was really interesting, is that the core of what was said at the time has not really changed. And I think the core of what was said at that time was looking and saying, one, what's the value of education abroad? And I working with phenomenal professionals at provider organizations, institutions, and otherwise, I think if we all sat in a room and said, let's talk about the value of education abroad, we would be there all day long, each one's kind of sharing their own personal experience and otherwise. But we can look and say, we talk about education abroad as something that can be a high impact practice, something that can impact students' academic achievement, their sense of self, their personal growth, and obviously from a career perspective as well, better position students to thrive professionally. And so we think of like education as it's this good, is good, but it's good that still so many of our students don't take advantage of. And still many of our students remain, particularly some of our students of color, first gen, students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, remain underrepresented in. And then even students from backgrounds who are going abroad aren't always served or supported in a way that they can truly take advantage of the benefits that are afforded through education abroad. And so when we get back to that kind of question, that why, when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, JEDI within education abroad, really that is the core of the why. If we know how much impact these experiences, these educational experiences can have on students, if we sit there and we rattle them all off, we can't rattle off there are all these benefits, but then at the same time, be okay with the fact that certain students don't get access to it, certain students don't go in the first place. And then you have another group of students that maybe they go, but they're not supported in a way where they're truly able to have access or benefit from education abroad opportunities. And so really looking at that as a core as far as why a commitment to JEDI and this work is so critical. It is a question of educational equity. We can again look and say these are the benefits, and certain students have access and certain don't, and that's a question of educational equity as a whole. And so that hasn't changed. I think what's been really exciting to see is how much more just across the board in the field, JEDI has become more central to the work that we're doing. But I always say kind of a word of caution. JEDI or DEI work, just doing it just to do it, isn't going to get us where we need. Really understanding the why. Angie, you were just kind of mentioning having stakeholders that want to invest. I say invest. I think of philanthropy. I think really investing, want to invest in education abroad. And if you look at philanthropy, there are tons of foundations and otherwise that are investing in education. They're investing in educational equity, but they may not be investing in study abroad. Well, why is that? Maybe it's because we haven't made that connection. And I say we, I think we as a field have to go all in and make that connection of the work that we're doing is about student belonging, student success is absolutely directly connected to that. And us making that connection, it makes it easier for those outside of education abroad, outside of international education, to look and say, you know what, absolutely, we want to be a part of that, because that experience of students studying abroad, that is part of what helps us get to this broader goal we have around student success, student academic achievement. And that's part of also what helps study abroad in our field as a whole to be a broader part of the major discussions that are being had in higher education around academic achievement, around student outcomes, around student success, and otherwise. We want to be center in that, but we can't be center in that if what we're doing, if the work that we're doing only centers on a small group of privileged students, and we're not thinking about, once we do diversify, we're not thinking about how do we truly support all of our students so that our students are positioned to be successful through this experience, leverage this experience towards their broader goals. And that's part of when we kind of look, going back to reading through the essay 10 years later, 10 years of conversations, 10 years of growth, 10 years of having these, being able to connect with folks like everyone we have on the call, I think helps us to appreciate that we have made a lot of progress. I can look on the screen right now with the group that we have this conversation with. Most of you I've known for 10 years. So we've been having this conversation for a long time, and I don't think any of us would say there hasn't been progress. There's been a lot of progress. But for our field, I would say to continue to be a critical aspect of the higher education ecosystem, that why this work matters, why this work has to be connected to the broader goals around the success for all of our students, and particularly our students who have been, quote unquote, at risk for so long. That's our why. That's why JEDI is so incredibly important to the foundation of the work that we're doing in education abroad. And I'm going to be excited to look 10 years from now when we come back and continue to have this conversation. There's always growth, but we'll look back and see the growth that we've made, but also the growth that we'll continue to. So again, thanks for giving me the space to be able to reminisce and go back and think of all the good work that collectively we've done. But also double down on the importance of continuing to move this work forward. So thank you for that. And I made the mistake of not remembering who I pass off to. So hopefully somebody will say, oh, and so it's even worse that it was my friend Martha. So we'll pass it up now to Martha Johnson. Thank you all.
Excellent. Thanks, Andrew. Well, again, thank you for the invitation. I share everyone's, it was a great exercise to go back and read this, what I'd written. I wrote mine in the fall of 2019. And so to be considering what were the prescient questions on my mind at that time, but it was a topic that I'd been presenting on for a while, and then to revisit where we are now. When I sat down to write this, it was a combination of some analysis I'd done. My academic area is literature with an emphasis in post-colonial literature. And so I think it was what drove me was part of the recognition of the framing of JEDI conversations and DEI conversations being very different for the rest of the world, but also how it was at the time when we suddenly started seeing this term decolonizing popping up everywhere. And I was a little bit disturbed by sometimes inappropriate use of it or a lack of clarity on what people were using. That's something I think we're still seeing a lot. And so it's a good time to reflect on all of these pieces and how they come together. When I reread this, I realized I probably should have put decolonizing in parentheses, because again, I wanted to interrogate the use of the term and to make sure that when we are using it, we are either using it the way it is defined by those who are doing that work, or in a way that we are very clear about how we are using it. And so I went on to look at two possible applications of the notion of decolonizing within the education abroad sphere. And the first is decolonizing who participates. And from that perspective, I think that one of the things that has adversely impacted a lot of the work we're talking about more broadly is, sometimes there is still a underpinning of wanting to send, the right kinds of students on the right sorts of programs and then this sort of opposition to skill building and things that are a tangible skill-based outcome in study abroad, and a privileging of altruism. I think it really needs to be pointed out that actually positions privilege in the very outcome. To say that altruism is worth more than someone doing it for career reasons is to not honor the motivations that most students have in pursuing a higher education degree. And so we've done the same colonial framework on the endeavor that we're doing, and shut the door on access by using that deficit language about motivations. And I think that that's really problematic. And so I think we have to look at the notions around how and who we think should go abroad, because if we're actually, again, going to make these massive changes, we have to challenge our own concepts of what are the right motivations for students to be going abroad, and embrace the fact that some of the ones that we might not like or think are the right ones need to be part of what we're doing, just from an access perspective and just from an inclusion perspective. And so I think that was a lot of the part of the essay. And then the second part was really interrogating this question of what it means to send students to the non-traditional sites. Particularly, I did a deep dive of the notion of study abroad in the English-speaking world, because that is such a problematic term. And it was interesting when I started doing this analysis, the grand total of students that I could count in the previous year's open doors who had gone to locations that we could agree would be post-colonial by agreed upon definitions of the post-colonial world, it was 45% of the students. And yet a thread of interrogating what that means for those cultures is very rarely woven into those programs. And so on one level, we are excited and celebratory about the fact that we can send students to India and have the experience all be in English, and we position India as an English-speaking country. Oh, but wait a minute, it isn't. And I think that as we are developing things in STEM and areas that we do want to be serving, we're getting into this slippery slope of choosing locations where students can in fact have a very cursory experience that is based in the ability to communicate in one of the language that is part of the local landscape. But to think that that isn't telling the picture, or to not make sure that the other elements of that are woven in is very, very problematic to me. And to not be also making sure that the students have some understanding of what the colonial process or decolonization process is in that culture. What does that mean for trade? What does it mean for healthcare systems? All of these forces, histories, cultural complexities that are part of what make it an ideal location for the things they're studying needs to be framed, I think, in that post-colonial lens more often and more effectively. And to echo what Andrew was just saying, I think that same question of why is so critical in this landscape, because you do hear of institutions saying, we are putting money for students to go to Africa. Wonderful, but tell me why. Because if you don't have a why, back to how to do things wrong is to be saying students who already have access challenges can only go to one spot, and you don't even know why they should go to that one spot, is something we need to be very, very careful of. And so I think how we approach these activities in these places. And then I'll just finally end with saying, as I reread this, I was, of course, struck by the fact that I'd like to, and I will go back and rerun those numbers, because these are many of the locations that we have abandoned and decimated and closed everything in. So study abroad's colonial moment was the pandemic. And I don't hear enough yet about how we are going to go back and rebuild those infrastructures and what we're going to do well by the many organizations and partners who were there for a very long time. And I get the complexities of where students are coming back to and what institutions are doing. I work in that context too. But I think we also have to really look in the mirror and address just when we are looking at development and infrastructure and how we are bringing these things back, at least an acknowledgement of our role in what has ultimately really hurt a lot of the places that were the most vulnerable in this to begin with. So I'm sorry, that all sounds a little bit not super positive. I do believe we can do all these things. I absolutely wouldn't say a word if I didn't believe these things were doable. And if I do believe that most faculty and instructors and students who are going to these places are incredibly open and interested in this part of the story. So I think the challenges for us as we're looking at program design, as we're working with things that we are building on our campuses and our organizations, to make sure we're doing that twist to make sure that the complexities of these places, along with the advantages, are part of the conversation. And with that, I will also pass it along to Giselda.
I'm going to jump in. I think, it's me and then
Keith.
Giselda.
No, it's
I
you.
did one worse, Andrew. I skipped over it. So there you go.
It's perfect. I'm actually a little nervous today, and so it would have been great to have Giselda go. But one of the great points of going after Martha is that there's so much in common that we have in our pieces and in our backgrounds. I think that you're going to see as we talk through this a little bit more. There's also so much of what everyone has said so far that's been like, okay, I can't also wait, Andrew, for the next 10 years and seeing where we get from this point. I'm Keshia Abraham. I work independently with a collection of friends and trying to advance international education and a sense of well-being for all of us in this independent space. When I wrote this initial essay, it was 2017. And I was a professor at the time, very much in my academic mode as a literature scholar. And so that's one of the points that I'm addressing that Martha and I have in common. My work is in post-colonial literature, particularly with an emphasis on the African diaspora and especially women's literature. At that time, I had no idea that I would be here. I think, we think about career trajectory and how we enter into this work and what it means to us while we're doing it. At that time, I was thinking so much about all of these topics from a very theoretical perspective. I was working to engage in growing international education at the historically Black college I was working at the time. And I think I was really struck by how different I found international education as a field to be from the academic spaces that I was working in at the time, what kind of questions we were asking and how we were moving these opportunities for students to have education of broad experiences, how we were moving those in somewhat kind of different ways and with a different, in my mind at the time, the ethos felt very different, the approaches felt very different. My work has been so much involved in how do we understand what colonialism has done to us, how we've been impacted by it, and what changes we need to make to get out of it. Trying to kind of decolonize the mind, to use the Ngugi wa Thiong'o framework, right? And so I've been feeling a lot of feelings as we say these days, right? I've been feeling a lot of feelings as I've been going back and reading through these essays and thinking about where I was at that time in my life. And why I wrote the things that I wrote here. I think what I want to start by saying initially too is that one of the biggest things that I've learned over the last, I guess, almost 10 years or so since this was done, also is how much more compassion we have to have for each other and for what growing this kind of work will require. It has helped me really to come to a place of unifying a different set of skills and different set of backgrounds that I never realized I was going to need so much. Being a yoga teacher and an Ayurvedic specialist, I need all of that to do this work now. Because it is heart work, it is heart work, it is head work. It involves so much of the presence of our bodies and how we understand those, engaging in different spaces at different moments. And so the original title of this article, this essay, was on globalization and colonization, when and where we enter. I was thinking about the Paula Giddings wonderful anthology in Black women's literature with a similar title that was looking at when and where we enter. and literally thinking about, where do people of color enter into these conversations? Where do people of color actually enter into a discourse on globalization, when at the time so many of our programs were, and so much of I think our focus was really on programs in locations that have colonial relationships with people of color. But we weren't talking about that. We just kept saying, you all need to go abroad and you all need to have these experiences. But okay, how are we having these experiences? Why are we having these experiences? And what does it mean for us to be in these engagements, in these locations together? What's happening when we travel together in these places? As faculty members, as students, as professionals, all of the different identities that we wear, how do we enter together into a space of making change? I think one of the most obvious things that I couldn't have predicted at the time was that my search for some language that would bring us to a place of honesty about why the work matters would have had such an impact. I mean, I thought, I really didn't think that talking about coming up with this concept of JEDI, meaning for me at the time, when I first started talking about it, justice and equity in diversity inclusion, I really didn't realize that the whole field was going to say, yeah, let's keep going in that direction and let's embrace us in this way. Because at the time, I think I was still seeing things in a very fractured way, right? That diversity, equity, and inclusion, which always felt very empty to me, was not about really people of color and making change for us. It really wasn't about addressing changes when we think about ability, when we think about different learning styles, when we think about different languages, different cultures. It really felt to me initially as a movement that was very much driven by, I'm going to say it openly and honestly, white guilt, and trying to make changes around those relationships to power and privilege. I think to have a sense of agency in this work required really understanding why are we doing this? And I think the purpose of this work is really about justice and equity. It's really about making structural, systemic changes that changes lives and communities and cultures for the greater good. So to do that, similar to what Martha was saying about how we understand where students are going and why, we have to be honest about the closing of programs in the locations that students of color are most interested in going to, right? How are we creating equity if we're just like, oh no, we don't understand what's happening over there. We just got to close those. We have to close those and then work to rebuild. And the rebuilding started from the globalization standpoint. I think it started from the same place that it started before, and that's very disturbing if we're honest about the why of this work. We have to be honest about who we are, what our intentions are, and also what our histories are. And that's some of what I talk about in this essay. I think one of the main points I wanted to address was this idea that globalization is what lies between our imagination and our intentions. It's what happens to us. Globalization seems to have haves and have-nots, actors and happens tos, authors and subjects, places and non-places. And in that, we often don't look at how are our histories taught to one another. So how are the histories, for example, of people of color in the US? And I'll be very specific. How is the history of the African diaspora taught around the world in the locations that we're sending students to? I think it's unsafe for us to continue to send students to places without primers in those countries also for what has been the experience of engagement. And this would be the case for every population that has been impacted by colonization. In every place, we have to understand those relationships with deeper nuances. And I think lastly, I would just say that this has been really a labor of love and an act of love. I think us all coming together in this way. I think we're all working through a lot of discomforts and transformations. I think we're all understanding of a greater sense these days, the personal as political, which is another one of the points I was addressing in this, and growing our capacity as learners and as spectators in this industry and profession. The clearer we are about our situatedness, the clearer we are as professionals able to help our students have that kind of clarity and that ability to go into the world feeling more whole, more empowered, and more centered, which is also how I've moved that initial framing of JEDI from the one I just said to one that I prefer now, which is looking at a sense of justice and equity with dignity and intention, because the dignity and intention part, I think, is our real goal. And I think I'll pass it off now to my dear friend Giselda.
Thank you. everyone on this call basically is an inspiration to me. So I feel like I'm in really incredible company, and I'm hoping my final remarks will be worthwhile here. My name is Giselda Beaudin, and I am the Director of Global Initiatives at Rollins College. It's a small private liberal arts institution in Florida. So the piece I wrote in 2016, which was a very different world. And it really came from a very personal place. So I wrote it, it really starts as a personal essay talking about my own struggles with I suppose what at least on the right they would now call cancel culture. I don't know if that term existed yet in 2016, but my own struggles with sort of noticing that we were tending sometimes within higher education to silence people when they had said something that was considered offensive or problematic. And feeling like perhaps there were opportunities for learning and dialogue that were being missed in that sort of urge to kind of to sort of make sure that people were not saying things that were inappropriate, and struggling myself with feeling like, when is my voice valid and when is my voice not valid, and not wanting to speak when it wasn't appropriate, but not being sure when sort of just a general sense of confusion. So that's really where I started this piece. And I ultimately argue in the piece that we we're kind of doing this interesting, we were sort of noticing this interesting phenomenon where the hard work of diversity work, of inclusion, is about structural change, right, and real changes, and that I argued that it was easier to publicly silence someone. That's a far, far easier thing to do than to rethink tenure and promotion, right? Which is a sacred structure within the institution that we're often not willing to even talk about, right? So thinking about the fact that, was this an easier way to deal with it, to sort of respond to these emotional moments, to people's personal reactions to things, that was an easier response than really creating spaces for dialogue and really trying to look at how we can institute meaningful change. So I in the piece, and I sort of say that perhaps international education offers something here, right? That there's a lot of overlap in terms of the learning goals, right? When you think about what you want someone to learn about diversity, about global diversity, about equity, right? And the learning goals within global learning, right? That there's a lot of overlap there, and perhaps there's a way to think about, right, how we could create a different narrative within higher education for discussing the complexities, right, the real complexities of these moments of tension around difference, around race, right, so all these different pieces. It was interesting to go back and read it, because since I wrote this piece, I have done a ton of work myself. So I am far, far more educated in terms of these issues now than I was then. I facilitated an anti-racism learning group at my institution for an entire year. I've done a lot of reading around sort of racism and anti-racism. I have, in my office, we have embarked on a multi-year project to really look at our own practices and policies and trying to think about how we can change our policies to be more inclusive, right, to provide more access. So I am leaps beyond where I was when I wrote this, but I also proudly say that I think I know less than when I wrote this. And I think that's really important, because I think that ultimately, going back and looking at this, I really thought a lot about the sort of framework of cultural humility, and that idea that if you're not familiar with the framework, one of the pillars is just this idea that we have to always be willing to question our assumptions, and always willing to kind of take that humble position of, perhaps there is a different way to see this, perhaps there is something else to learn, right? And I think it's easy to talk about that, but really hard to do, right? And I think for me, that's the thing that I would sort of walk away from this piece, looking at it again, is sort of this idea that I do think that international education offers a really interesting possibility around creating spaces for discussion of complexity, right? And everyone, I mean, sort of Martha and Keshia's comments, right, sort of lead right into this too, the fact that we can't, right, sort of flatten things into sort of simple explanations of what spaces are or how we call them, or right, sort of this idea of you know, kind of decolonizing or going into colonial, post-colonial or colonial spaces. You know, and Andrew's comments about the fact that yes, we've done a lot of work, but also that that we have more work to do, right? And I think some of that work is in that sort of hard, structural, difficult work of actually making changes. And if we actually want to make changes, we are going to have to be willing to look at things differently and to accept that things may not be, you know, working the way we think they are, or that perhaps we went and bounce something the wrong way, right? Or that perhaps we did, right, sort of silence people who shouldn't have been silenced, and that perhaps that wasn't the right way to go about it, and maybe there are different ways of thinking about it. So I think basically in my broad strokes, right, I sort of agree broadly still with myself that I am still concerned about the fact that I think cancel culture has actually gotten worse on the left and on the right. The right likes to pretend they don't have cancel culture. They absolutely do, right? I also wrote in the piece about sort of the idea of dichotomies and kind of being stuck, right? Obviously, it's more divisive than ever before. I think narratives have gotten hardened, both in the United States, but also globally, right? I think we have these sort of narratives that have been hardened around the world that are very oppositional. So I think more than ever, I do still think we need this third space. And I do think that global learning is a really interesting place to start exploring that third space. And I guess I will leave it there. So yes, I know nothing is where I will leave it. And I'm happy about that.
That is one of the least credible things Giselda's ever said. And we have some comments that I'll address, but I wonder if before we do that, do we as a body, does anybody want to comment on what we have said to each other? Are there any critiques or comments that come to mind? I have one, and I wondered if anybody else, I don't want to hog this. All right, now, let me throw out mine and then see what you think. One of the things that Martha talked about, that Keshia talked about, that in a sense was undermining, was there in everybody, was this question of decolonization of practice and curriculum. But one of the things I tried to say was that we live in a very hostile time to things that enable us to decolonize curriculum. And I'm thinking about the assault on the humanities. And I sort of think we're kind of blind to this at the minute, that we go on and say, well, we've got to look at the decolonizing curriculum. What are the tools for decolonizing curriculum? Predominantly, there must be literature and history, you know, the voices that are not heard and pasts that are not recognized. Yet we're under assault, and we seem to be blind about this. So I don't know if this is just an old curmudgeon moaning, or if this is worthy of comment from my colleagues or anybody else.
Keshia, come on, you know you got some.
Am I that transparent? No, I totally agree with this, Mike, so much. I think about this a lot. I think part of my resistance to acronyms is because I want us to like use words, like actual words, like read books, use words, read history, like read everything. And I think that's one of the things that has been really, I think it's a byproduct, right, of the education systems that are minimizing the humanities and their impact on the world. I think even as a field, you know, we've moved so much from so many of us with humanities backgrounds, humanities as a way of kind of finding our way into international education, to a very social sciences approach, very business approach, which I think also undergirds what Angie was talking about in terms of like this relationship that is very much A over B, you know, givers versus receivers, and this kind of, you know, transactional, developing people, creating a sense of transactional leadership with people, as opposed to helping us develop our relationships, giving us more space and more opportunities to consider what undergirds our relationships. How do we begin to understand each other and the world in ways that are meaningful? And I think that's where international education has some, and to me, it's it is a space where change can happen. It is a space that has always been kind of the sacred, almost the sacred secret in a way, where transformational education happens outside of sometimes the formal academic structure. You can have a course that looks like, the traditional course in name. I'll just give a quick example. So I would teach let's call it world literature class, right? It's a requirement, everybody has to take world literature. But not everybody is going to take a world literature class and be intentional about including a global learning component to that, making sure that we're kind of engaging with learning on both sides. I think we put pressure on educational systems to really be more honest and more engaged with the tools that our future will require us to really be cultivating. And so we need more arts. We need more appreciation of what it takes to create art. And that requires more reading, that requires more practice. It requires being able to stand in that space of creation together.
And I would add to everything that I utterly agree that she just said, but I will add, I do think that there is often, and in higher education in the US certainly, but in other parts of the world, there is this unfortunate pinning of, faculties against each other. And I would say, which was one of the points I was trying to make, I think it was a failure of the field of study abroad to be so resistant for so long to short-term programs, to STEM-based programs. The opportunity could have been there to partner more effectively on many campuses. And that's not to say it never happens. There are models, but I think that many practitioners and scholars were so worried about how that would play out that they did not offer themselves as a partner in that endeavor. And again, in my experience, if you offer, would you like someone to come in and give an overview of these things, and it won't be perfect, but it would be 3 hours of this. Instructors don't say no. They actually think that's really wonderful, but I don't know that our field has done a great job of actively saying, wonderful that you're going to go teach, fluid dynamic power in India. And it's been this sort of binary that's been set up about these two things being in opposition. And I don't know that that's been asked for, so it's been on both sides, but I think that in some ways, yes, the disciplines that are the most useful in this space are under fire, are underfunded, and therefore are a little bit threatened and not always as open and haven't been as proactive in how they could partner in these spaces. That's just my opinion, but I do see that dynamic.
Thank you. I thought we'd shift a bit now, and I've asked Ellen if she would ask her question. So she would have to, what do you call it? Unmute, demute, become articulate. Because she had a very, very good and interesting point, which I think needs a little bit of explanation. Ellen, can you do that?
Am I the only Ellen on here?
Yeah, well, you're the one I mean.
All right, first of all, thank you, thank you, thank you. This discussion, which I'm going to listen to again, so I can keep up with all you big minds. This is why I work with FEA. I just think, my point is, I am not in higher ed. I'm not in study abroad as a business. I'm a communicator, and I work with quite a number of disruptors, getting venture capital and helping people tell their story. And one of the things that we found, and Angie brings up a very good point about, where's the money coming from? It has to be funded. And to everyone's point now, arts and humanities are being taken out of elementary school. There won't even be, students won't even know that they're missing something. Teachers won't even know that they're missing something by the time students are ready. So, but I think that one of the things that we haven't done well, and we've been banging our heads against the wall trying to raise money for more scholarships and trying to break into corporate funding and venture capital funding and other sorts of funding, is that we have not made the case. And you have to, if anyone wants to disrupt anything, and the whole world's being disrupted right now on every level, you have to explain the challenge. And people don't see international education as like nourishment. You know, they don't see it necessarily as life-giving. They don't see it as peace building. You know, people aren't, you know, people who could possibly give money don't see it as urgent, that there's an urgency. And they don't see, you know, from our own colonial side, you know, like how we keep, you know, we're not making those leaps that you're all speaking about because we're not even looking at ourselves correctly. You know, so anyway, I think just as an observer of this industry, basically this sector, I think the sector needs to make a much better argument for why international education is so important. Of course, the higher ed sector is right now having to make an argument for why higher ed is important. I've been saying for years, you know, no institution, no sector was going to be as disrupted as brutally as higher ed was going to be. I said that 10 years ago, and now we see it happening. So anyway, I'll shut up now. But I think that we do need to make the case, and we need to come together and make the case.
You know, there's another comment that do you want to comment on this now? I'll move on to, there's another speaker who would like to speak. So could I ask Kaya, is that the correct pronunciation? Kaya Campbell to speak a little bit to the comment she made? Is she still here? No, maybe not.
Hello, sorry, my computer is a little bit slow today.
Oh, she is still here. Great. Yeah. Do you want to tell us a bit more about your comment and see if anyone?
Yeah, it's just something that I was thinking about, and I have constantly thought about, kind of in this whole idea of reformation and kind of diversity and inclusion becoming so grand across so many companies and schools and everywhere, but we're kind of still trying to work within the frame that already exists, when the basis of doing this reformation is trying to get out of that frame. And so I don't know if I have all the terminology to describe it, but it's something that I've thought a lot about lately. You know, why are we making all of these scholarships when they shouldn't exist for such a need to begin with? These students should be able to attend schools nationally and internationally without such financial discrepancy between them. And so that's something that I think is really important, and kind of, you know, I've worked with FEA, so I'm FEA in specific, but how do then we say we actually get out of this mindset that students don't need scholarships? What kind of company do we become? What kind of space are we that offers support to students if it's not financial, if we have reached that space where students don't need this anymore? Just kind of throwing that idea out there, something on my mind. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think I'm getting signals that we're moving towards the end of this session. You know, I was going to wrap up, you know, but it's impossible because this is a very rich field of discussion, of overlap, of mutual goodwill, but mutual search for the perceptions that will lead to actions. And that's the key, isn't it? Because we can talk about it forever. I remember conversations at CIE back in the early 80s, you know, and the language has changed, but the intent hasn't, and we still struggle. So before I pass over to Angie to close down this, I want to thank everybody who's participated, and those who haven't participated. Listening is also a form of participation. And really, it's been a very interesting time for me right from the beginning. I'll put a plug in for occasional paper 9, which is on Empires of the Mind and Colonization. Is still available in print and online, not from Amazon, but free from us. You have to go to our website. And with that, I thought I'd end with the idea that disagreements for the sake of heaven are always creative. And Angie, I'll pass back to you.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you everybody for joining us. As is typically the case with these, I'm now leaving with more questions that I came in with, but I think that is a good place to be. Kaya, I know how to get in touch with you, so don't worry. I'm going to be talking to you about the question about disruption. But I thank you all for being here. I want to thank DIS Study Abroad for being our sponsor for FEA Day events today. We still have one more session this afternoon. If you have any students who are interested in applying for an FEA scholarship, we have an applicant webinar coming up at 3 p.m. And it actually has a little writing workshop that yours truly will be leading, that hopefully students will take some skills, not just for the FEA application, but for other applications and essay prompts they may have in the future. But thank you all so much for being here. Martha, Keshia, Giselda, Andrew, Mike, and then to Kaylee and Lindsay, our staff, our FEA staff who have been supporting us with tech needs in the background. So it was wonderful to see so many faces, and I really do think we can get to that 4th P of progress in the next year, month, weeks, days, hours, maybe. Every little bit helps. So thank you all for just being constant champions of JEDI guided study abroad practices.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.